This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So we're very pleased to welcome Green, who is in a way coming home.
Hi.
Please.
Hi there. Yeah, nice to see you again.
Yes,
Well,
you're here for some time.
I am. Yeah, I'm in London for one day, but.
Oh right, but you're in the UK because I thought you were talking somewhere else.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
We're talking all over. That's right.
All over the place. Good.
Thanks for coming. Sorry, Taylor.
Right.
We just.
Yes. It's a bad.
interrupted
I don't
by
know how many
introducer.
people are going to come today because it's a bit of a bad time.
So Niall's come home in a way because he did his PhD at SOAS just around the corner. And he is one of those really annoying scholars who's very prolific, so I'm not going to take you through all of the things that he's produced, but of course he's well known for his work on Sufism in South Asia and beyond, and is recently taking his study of Islam much more in a transnational direction with his book Bombay Islam, of course. And this is a project that is what he's presenting today is part of a larger project where the book is coming out soon, called Terrains of Exchange, where he's following those transnational links even further. So I will just turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Taylor, and thank you to Taylor and to Nauka for the invitation. It's really nice to be back here in Senate House after I don't know how many years. I don't care to know how many years. So I'll be talking today on the topic of A Tale of Two Mosques, Impresarios of Islam in America and Japan. And what I'd like to do in this talk, I'm going to go on for around 50 minutes, is to answer two questions which I think have a kind of a larger, general remit rather than just with regard to America and Japan. The first of those questions is how, in the early 20th century, Islam became a truly global religion. That's to say, reaching beyond the geographies across Africa and Asia of its kind of early modern period, if you like, of global expansion in that Eurasian and African mode, and moving beyond the colonial world as well to, by the early 20th century, as I say, to start moving into what are really truly global terrains. The examples I'm using of that today then are the United States and Japan. And then by looking at the how of this happened, how Islam did become a truly global religion, I want to look at, try to identify processes and agents really that go beyond just, as it were, more passive models of migration, let's say. The second question I want to ask is really a sub-question, is why were Indian Muslims disproportionately influential in that global outreach? Why was that the case? So I'll be addressing these two questions through this comparative case study then of the first mosques built in the United States and Japan, which were both built within a decade of one another in the early 1920s and 30s. So I'll be drawing on field work I've been doing in Detroit and in Kobe as well as other cities in Japan. I'll be showing you some of my photographs and some of the archival materials and other materials I've been using. So the aim of what I'm trying to do here is to extrapolate some of the forces behind this process of global Muslim expansion. And I'm identifying here, or working within a key period that in a recent book I edited with James Gelvin, Global Muslims in the Age of Steam and Print, we call this period of steam and print globalization. That's to say, this is of course a period in the second half of the 19th century, the first half of the 20th century, when the steam age in a sense, but of course for Muslims this is also the print age, the period when Muslims have access for the first time to printing technology. So one has this, as it were, this kind of combined double whammy, this combined and compressed double impact of printing technologies and steam technologies, so this kind of ability to communicate and travel on a much wider and of course ultimately global scale. The period I'll be looking at today is the sort of one part of that larger, longer age of steam and print, the 1900s and 1930s. And I want to show how Muslim expansions in this period then, expansions ultimately worldwide, were outcomes and responses to earlier 19th century interactions with non-Muslims. In other words then, I'm going to be talking through a larger process that begins in the 19th century and as it were starts to reach certain outcomes, the global spread of Islam, the foundation of these first mosques in the United States and Japan, as well as others in the same period in places like Germany and London. And these are part of then of a larger, longer term process. I think this is important to point out that the 19th century origins then of as it were, this global move, because these Muslim movements and what I'll be calling impresarios and religious firms in the 1900s, 20s and 30s were not the heirs to the earlier period of early modern Muslim globalization. They weren't, for example, the Sufi brotherhoods that formed very effective organizational and institutional means of spreading Islam to as far apart as China, Africa and Southeast Asia in the early modern period. They were then these religious firms and impresarios. These were new hybrid organizations that were indeed the products of exchange with Europe and particularly with the European missionaries and empires in the 19th century. So I'll be showing then Muslim history as part of global history and part of that larger story we associate with global history of interaction, exchange, entanglement. But also I want to kind of put into that kind of familiar trio of global history the process of competition as well. And competition is analytically distinct from conflict. And competition, then, I'll be showing as an important process which explains how new religious entrepreneurs, firms, impresarios were very dynamic and protean, which helps us, I think, historicize religion and move away, as it were, from the more the language of continuity and tradition. What we see in here is the word dynamism and indeed innovation. So the methods I'm drawing on today, about a third of this talk will be, as it were, looking through this earlier 19th century enabling factors. Then the second two-thirds will be talking about the two case studies. The methods I'm using here, they draw on a book that I have coming out, probably by the summer, Terrains of Exchange, Religious Economies of Global Islam, as it will be in the final title. And in this book, I worked through a series of chapters, looking first of all in the early chapters at early 19th century, what I call imperial evangelical propagation, the period from the early 1800s, when there are new forms of missions, new forms of missionary organization that invest in a very large way in vernacular printing, printing in the vernaculars of the Muslim world and indeed the vernaculars of the wider world altogether. And of course this is crucial in a period when no Muslims are printing whatsoever anywhere. So what we have by the mid-19th century then, the middle chapters of that book, and part of the story, the backstory as it were today of this kind of 19th century enabling process, by the middle to late 19th century we start to see a series in different places worldwide of different Muslim responses to that evangelical Christian propagation. Muslim then responders start to adapt and adopt the methods and techniques and indeed the technologies of the Christian missions. They start then to form counter missions, Muslim missions then, as it were, as a counter to the Christian missions, that are at work largely within geographies within Asia, in places like India and largely within Southeast Asia, but within kind of Asia and perhaps even in sort of an imperial geography as their remit. What I'll be focusing on today then is the third stage of that kind of process of exchange and interaction, when by the early 20th century, Muslims start to, and new Muslim firms having adopted and adapted these techniques and technologies, start to form a new propagation of Islam and outreach to the entire world. And I'll be taking, of course, the examples then of the United States and Japan, but various missions at work in places like Europe as well could also be included in that. So the geographical scope I'm dealing with here, of course, is multi-sited and it's comparative as well as connective research in various ways. And it's what I think, a model of what I think global history should try to be, which is what I call a kind of form of polyphonic history, which is to say working from multiple languages and multiple primary materials and be trying to generate global history, as it were, as a form of microhistory that starts from the bottom up and works incrementally to a global stage. Whereas, of course, many of you know that the field of global history as such, with its origins in various things of world systems theory and so on, has had a larger tendency to be working with larger models and a kind of a top-down form of a historical methodology. So I'm trying to work, as it were, from, as it were, core primary materials, from, as it were, core agents and institutions and organizations, to try to identify then the cultural dynamics and the human agents at work in these what are ultimately global processes. A word about theory then as well. The theories I'm building on in the book and indeed in the paper today come out of sociology, and two rather distinct wings of sociology that I wed together and try to build on for my own purposes. One is the work of the sociologist Michael Mann, and of course in his well-known multi-volume work, The Sources of Social Power. And in that work, he identifies religion as one of the forms of what he calls ideological power. As a form then, ideological power, religious power, as a form of social power. And of course, man is rather distinct from, let's say, Foucault, and has a, kind of a much less of, let's say, kind of a darker sense of the word here. I think man's use of social power will be, I think, more akin to what a lot of us think in terms of agency, let's say. Social power then is the ability to shape the ideas and the actions of others. It's the ability to create communities and forms of leadership, to organize and direct collective efforts, to shape the desires and the wills of others. So it's something rather distinctive then perhaps to other forms of power. So social power in this way, religion as a means of generating, creating, controlling such power. One of man's other key points then, and this is something I want to particularly take up today, is his identification of institutions and organisation as really absolutely key to the production of social power. So when I'm looking at religion here, and I'm looking at kind of Muslims and Muslim expansion, I'm not interested, or I'm not primarily interested in belief, not least because it's so intangible and immeasurable. What I am interested in is identifying new forms of religious organisation and institution building, what I call religious firms, and in this case the examples of the institutions they build, the mosques, as real as it were concrete forms of organising and thereby generating social power in Michael Mann's terms. So aside from Mann, the other sociologist I'm building on is Rodney Stark. Rather less known, but Rodney Stark's worked in the sociology of religion and created, really during the 1970s and 80s, but it has really kind of spread more in the study of the Americas rather than in Asia, the model of religious economy. And it's important to recognise that Stark is, although he uses the word economy, of course he's working as a sociologist, and what he's trying to do is create a holistic sociological model of religion that takes on board not just as it were the traditional way of looking at religion, which is often in terms of what he would call the producers, people who write religious texts, people who create churches, as it were, leaders and so on, but to actually bring together in terms of a common study what he would call the supply side and the demand side of religion in any given holistic terrain, which he would call a religious economy or a marketplace. So Stark's model identifies the production and the consumption dynamics of religion, the complete amount, as it were, of religion and religious activity in any given marketplace, in any given society, as being an interplay, and importantly a dynamic interplay between these different forces of supply and demand. So the shape of religion, the contours of religion, the constant recreation, or in some cases the vibrant and highly productive and variegated religion in a given society, in other cases the more static and unchanging and less dynamic social life or religion in a different society, are outcomes of these dynamics of interplay between suppliers and demanders, as it were. He also identifies the way in which there is competition in at least, as it were, more varied and productive religious economies, competition between religious suppliers to gain followers and consumers. And this is important because it points us towards a dynamic of the variation of different types of religious supply, of different types of religious products and services in order to compete for, as it were, for followers for the demand side of the marketplace. So he also, as it were, of course, what Stark is doing, I think, helpfully, is creating an analytical vocabulary that is consistent, as it were, in looking at all of the different parts and constituents and, as it were, players in any given religious, as it were, landscape qua religious economy. So he talks also in terms of the products and services created by suppliers in order to reach and attract followers, ultimately, demanders. These might be, as it were, things such as value, which of course economists talk a great deal about the production of value now. Often we think of value and meaning in life, if you like, but here I talk about value. There might be, again, other, as it were, symbolic or intangible products and services, such as salvation, or somewhat more tangible, healing, of course, the kind of services that religious specialists perform in many societies. There might be, as it were, slightly more tangible, again, in the social world, forms of religious networking and forms of religious community building, again, for various purposes, both from the demander side, as it were, and the supplier side. Or again, working along towards a more tangible forms of religious services, charity, the provision of food and other goods, and indeed, ultimately, the provision of income as well. But of course, what we're looking at then here is a range of products and services from the symbolic to the material, But of course these are all, and this is very key to Stark's model, in a dynamic process of exchange. The products and services then are exchanged for the loyalty, the commitment, the following of people in larger society, as it were, from the demand side. And of course also, there's not only, but there is also of course a material and a financial dimension of that too, whether in terms of tithes, donations, endowments and whatever else. So again, you can see what Stark is doing, is trying to form a complete model, as it were, of religious activity that brings, as it were, the immaterial and material, the supply and the demand side, all of the workings of religion within a society. I think what's useful from this model then, and what I'll be taking up in particular today, is certain aspects of that analytical vocabulary. And I'll be talking today in terms of religious entrepreneurs and religious firms. So that's to say from the demand side then of the religious economy. And I think this language is very analytically useful, not least because the language of to speak of religious entrepreneurs takes us away from that very kind of stagnant language in the study of religion, of talking about tradition. And talking about entrepreneurs also allows us to factor in religious innovation and change, of course, which is crucial for our work as historians studying religion and the social life of religion. And I think that's particularly important with regard to the study of Islam, because the study of Islam, whether among theologians, historians, anthropologists, or you name it, has largely adopted much of the emic, as it were, the internal vocabulary of Muslims themselves. And of course among Muslims, the idea of innovation, the term innovation, bidah in Arabic, is, as it were, a very negative term. No Muslims will ever admit that they are doing innovation, they're doing bidah. And yet, of course, if we are, to measure religion and trace religion historically, we need to see change and innovation. So all the more need, I think, to develop an ethic and external analytical vocabulary. So the language of entrepreneurship is, I think, useful, and particularly useful for the study of Islam as historians. The language of religious firms, the idea of a religious firm, rather than, let's say, kind of the vague language of religious groups or cults or sects or schools, or worse still, jumbling up all of these terms in a kind of a mixed bag analysis that so often happens. To talk about religious firms, I think, again, is very useful because it creates a standardized language that nonetheless recognizes the variable forms of organization and thereby different levels of success, the variable forms of organization that different types of religious firm will use. And I'll be talking about that more in detail with my case studies. So we can have local, national or transnational firms which adopt and perhaps are more innovative in adopting and adapting different techniques. So again, we can see the dynamics of the production of social power qua religious power through the creation of new types of religious firm led by different religious entrepreneurs. So I realized that this language, when I use this kind of analytical language and this model in my Bombay Islam book, the one complaint that people sometimes and quite often had was that they didn't like this vocabulary. It was jarring. It seemed to be reductive for many people to be talking about the religious life of Muslims or others. But I think for me it functions in that way all the better, because it is, as it were, a bitter pill that I think has all the better remedy. I use it, as it were, as an anti-rhetoric, that it's such, as it were, an unpleasant and unfamiliar language about religious entrepreneurs and firms, that I think it usefully creates an analytical distance from the more familiar language that I think allows us to see what's going on all the more clearly. So today I'll be focusing on then a couple of particular types, new types of religious entrepreneur and firm that emerge out of these 19th century interactions with Christian evangelical firms which are active across the Muslim world and indeed across the globe. And seeing about how through those interactions and exchanges we see new types of Muslim religious entrepreneur and firm become to operate in the United States and Japan. So the next section then, I'll be looking at something of that enabling background, those 19th century exchanges. So the 19th century period of imperial globalization was a period of great religious transformation among Muslims, and I think that's fairly well known. I think one of the ways that helps explain that, and I think the two sides, as it were, of transformation are often put together, is that the Christian profile of empire, not least the British Empire, what I've often called an evangelical empire, is really key to understanding those transformations. Not just merely the colonial impact. I'm actually talking about not so much the impact of the colonial state, as it were, than of the religious firms, the Christian religious firms, the missionaries that I think are more influential than the religious, as it were, than the colonial state itself. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is due to the particular, perhaps peculiar political economy of British colonisation, not least in South Asia, with the tradition then of, as it were, British liberalism. And I use that, I hope, in a value-free term. And as Stark uses the term liberalism as well within the language of religious economy, this is a position then within political economy when the state steps back from directing religious and the flow of religion, as it were, favouring particularly religious groups in any society. The state then steps back, the colonial state or any other state, has a policy then of non-interference in the religious life of its subjects. And of course this is officially the case within British India and in other regions as well. Of course we know from various studies, I've written a book about this myself, the way that's not necessarily always the case. Of course the state wasn't always true to, of course, those liberal principles and non-interference in the religious life of its subjects. But relatively speaking, it was, of course. And I think there's little doubt in that, of course, when we compare, let's say, some of the early modern empires, let's say kind of the Catholic empires, with, as it were, the British Empire. And again, you know, my point here isn't about creating, as it were, value judgments, but recognizing the kinds of political conditions that enabled greater religious exchange and dynamism. And ironically, what this, as it were, this position of non-interference in religious exchange, the religious economy of the empire enabled, ironically what that enabled was then the entry of a multiplicity of different Christian firms into the British Empire, into, let's say, colonial India in this particular case. And of course these were firms that were non-allied to the state. Many of the firms, of course, were non-establishment Christian groups, the various dissenting groups, the Baptists and so on and so forth. So we have this particular burst of activity then between about 1790 and 1910, when, as I'm sure many of you will know, we have the foundation of the British and Foreign Bible Society, the Church Missionary Society, the London Missionary Society, the Baptist Missionary Society, all of these very active in India from 1813, but also a very large number of foreign firms, foreign religious firms as well. The American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the Evangelische Missionsgesellschaft zu Basel, the largest of the Central European German or Germanic pietistic missionary societies, the Société des Missions Étrangères based in Paris, so a Catholic mission as well. So the point is that, as it were, that there's this whole very wide variety of different missionary firms active throughout Muslim regions, and I study a range of these in the book. Today we'll be talking more about India as the focus. And what's important is seeing these as very different and distinctive from the earlier Catholic missions of the early modern period. These are innovative religious firms, foreign firms entering, as it were, a foreign marketplace in South Asia, a foreign religious economy, and they're innovative in two particular ways. The first is in terms of technology and forms of communication. They're great pioneers of vernacular printing. Printing, of course, in all of the vernaculars of South Asia and indeed of the wider Muslim world, of many obscure languages. And of course, again, this is a period in which no Muslim is printing anywhere. So I've worked rather extensively on this in a series of articles. And this creates, what actually this generates, in fact, is the Muslim response, that we know that the Muslim beginnings of printing by Muslims in a variety of places, whether Iran or India or elsewhere, actually comes in reaction and indeed in connection through borrowing and adapting the technologies of the Christian missions. So one of the great then innovations that these new missions of around 1800 bring is vernacular printing and also mass production. So the mass production of Bibles and tracts and anti-Muslim tracts in particular in many, many different languages and indeed in vernacular languages. And their other great technological, rather communicational innovation is training, linguistically trained polemical preachers who are dispatched very effectively into many Muslim regions, and indeed in regions beyond the borders of colonial control. And of course these are both the texts and the persons distributed through new, as it were, communication technologies of steam and rail. So the first innovation of these firms is in terms of technology and communication. The second set of innovations are with regard to organisation and funding. The mission, as we know it, is very much, as I say, kind of very much a product of this period. These are new types of organisation with clear agendas and aims, with clear kind of charters, with forms of lay organization, which distinguishes them from the earlier Catholic missions of the early modern period, funded by voluntary subscriptions through their forms effectively of modern voluntary association, with very effective means of fundraising as well through their lay organization, their lay members. They also use, as it were, 19th century modern forms of legal, commercial and industrial techniques. This was an impact that was felt as much as at home as abroad. There's the work of Leslie Howsham on the way in which the Bible Society and the printing of the Bible in Britain by the Bible Society completely revolutionized the printing and publishing industry in Britain as a whole. You can imagine the scale of that impact in societies where there were no printed books whatsoever, printing the vernaculars of the first time. There often weren't even texts written in those vernacular languages. So there's a double impact of mass production, print, free distribution, and writing in vernaculars as well. So what we see then is this period from around 1800 to 1830 when these Christian firms are rapidly expanding and creating franchises in colonial and non-colonial regions, creating, as it were, evangelical bridgeheads in many Muslim terrains, many Muslim regions, whether in India, the Malay states, Persia, China even, the Caucasus, East Africa, Malta, the Ottoman Empire. So this is a very, as it were, a global outreach, because of course the same firms are as active with their franchises in the South Pacific as they are in the Caucasus. And what this creates then, what I'm interested in then, is the response, the Muslim response to these innovative foreign firms. It creates a process of dynamic and generative exchange. And that's what I'm interested in. Exchange becomes generative, that there's actually kind of new types of religion, new types of religious organization and religious life and religious, as it were, publication, and this process of generative exchange through competition between the Christian religious firms and the new Muslim religious firms that we'll see coming about. Because, of course, the Christian firms are involved in polemics, the printing of books, the sending of preachers, that coincides, and of course is amplified by, of course, the political takeover of colonial states. This is then a form of evangelical imperialism, as I've called it. And this does indeed generate a huge Muslim response that has a corresponding, as it were, a catalytic effect. So I think the Christian missionaries, as it were, act as catalysts that start to have, as it were, certainly unintended consequences as Muslim entrepreneurs adopt and adapt Christian techniques and technologies. And of course, with their greater knowledge of local society, of local terrain, of local languages, of local cultural preferences, a better sense of demand within the language, analytical language of religious economy, those Muslim religious entrepreneurs were often much more successful than the Christian religious firms with whom they were competing. But of course, ultimately then, it's this process of exchange that I'm interested in, because of course the evangelicals themselves were learning from Muslims just as much as the Muslims were learning from them. Here is this an image of Henry Martin sitting translating scripture and learning Persian and Urdu as he does from a munshi. So there's constantly a two-way process of exchange going on. What we see happening then as this exchange continues is the adoption of printing around the year 1820, literally within a couple of years of 1820. We see printing adopted by Muslims for the first time in Calcutta, in London, in Istanbul, in Cairo, in Tabriz, then in Tehran, as well as in other places such as in the Caucasus and in southern Russia. So we have this kind of very confined period of Muslim entrepreneurial responses to the impact then of these new missionary firms with their new communication technology. We can really trace the impact and that exchange very closely. One example is Henry Martin, that famous Cambridge missionary who goes out to Calcutta and then goes to Persia. The local munshi who he has to help him translate the Bible into Persian. We have the names of these figures there in the earlier slide I showed you there, with Mirza Fitrit and others. One of those others was Javad ibn Sabat. And in response to helping, as it were, Martin translate the Bible, of course, Javad ibn Sabat had to convert himself. Then he converted back to Islam and used the printing techniques and technology that he had accessed through Martin and printed what is possibly what is certainly, it seems to be the first Muslim book printed by a Muslim in South Asia. And that's a book called the Barahin-e Sabatiyya, fi irad al-aqaid al-nisada, which is to say the proofs of Sabat in confutation of the principles of the Christians. So he's absolutely answering back. And again, we see this kind of two-way exchange going on with several of these helpers. Another case here, we have the well-known book, perhaps the most famous of all 19th century evangelical treatises by the Reverend Karl Gottlieb Pfander, his Mizan al-Haq, which is to say the balance of truth. And this was printed originally in Persian, and then in a series of languages it was printed and retranslated from the Caucasus into South Asia. And then in South Asia, one of the earlier figures with whom Pfander has a direct face-to-face, as it were, public disputation with, Rahmatullah Kedanavi, a very important 19th century Muslim figure, he responds by writing and printing in Istanbul in Arabic. So again, it's his borrowing and using of different languages of mass communication, and of course these new printing technologies as well. And he responds with his book, not Mizan al-Haq, but Azhar al-Haq, not the balance of truth, but the, as it were, the manifestation of truth, the real truth. Of course, an apology for Islam, in which he also borrows the same techniques of the Christians in reverse. Whereas Pfander had used, as it were, pietist and Protestant biblical studies of kind of the close study of Scripture, adopted those to study the Quran to better confute it and show its contradictions, those kind of classic German Protestant techniques of exegesis. Rahmatullah Kadanawi borrows those in reverse, uses various texts of translated into English that he can access of Protestant, as it were, Bible study, and uses those to confute the Bible by showing its contradictions in turn. So there's this real process of two-way exchange going on. So through borrowing not only these new techniques of communication, but techniques of confutation and contradiction, of competition, in a word, but also borrowing those forms of organization from the missions as well, from around the 1860s then, so it takes a few decades to work through to the founding of new Muslim organizations, then new religious firms. From around the period from around the 1860s to the 1900s, we see a whole series of them, and they're using a new language that they're borrowing either directly or through calque translation from the Christian missions. So we have the word often used by some of these organizations in Urdu, mission, which of course is a direct borrowing from the English. We have a translation, isha'at, the use of a new word for propagation. We have a well-known word, of course, from the Tablighi Jama'at, one of the most famous of these organizations worldwide. Tabligh, of course, meaning again to spread or to propagate or indeed to preach. Da'wah, an Arabic term used in the Arabic word, or irshad. So there are so many of these new organizations formed through interaction with the Christian missionaries and through adaptation of their organizational as well as their communicational techniques. In the Middle Eastern context, one of the most famous of these is Rashid Ridda, of course, the great Arab modernist figure, reformist figure. His Jama'at al-Dawah wal Irshad, founded in 1913. His organization for da'wah, so preaching, wa irshad, rightful guidance. So again, these organizations are adapting and often much more effectively adopting and adapting the techniques of the Christian missions to preach both in vernacular but also European and global languages, including English by the 20th century. So what we're seeing going on here then is a classic kind of case study of religious economy. The model of religious economy kind of makes, I think, all this stuff very clear, because we're seeing a process of dynamic, generative exchange through the entry of innovative foreign firms using new, effectively industrial techniques of printing and mass printing, the entry of those foreign firms into colonial markets, which triggers local entrepreneurial responses, which in turn leads to the Muslim adaptation of their foreign and rival firms' techniques and technologies, the founding of new Muslim firms, and, Parquet Michael Mann, Muslim empowerment through the creation of new organizations and through means of distribution that create religious power, social power for these various Muslim entrepreneurs and firms, which then, as we'll start to see in a minute when I move to America and Japan, Muslim expansion worldwide into new Christian marketplaces, religious marketplaces. In short then, we see the process of what I call generative exchange, which I think is the larger global process going on behind the so-called Muslim revival of the later 19th and 20th century. So let's look a little bit then, to begin with, about why were Indian Muslims so successful in this process of exchange, organisations such as the Tablighi Jama'at. Well, I think that the answer to that is that Indian Muslims were really very much at the colonial front line of evangelical imperialism. Indian Muslims were living in the regions that saw the deepest and most sustained interaction with these foreign missionary firms. In response then, they were much more able to effectively adapt to Christian techniques and technologies. Many Indo-Muslim transnational religious firms founded in this period, such as the Tablighi Jama'at, started to travel first of all and expand through the travel networks of the British Empire, which of course in itself, through the policies of free movement, were geographies of, as it were, liberal exchange, again in value-free terms, I hope. Such organisations among the best known, of course, were the Ahmadiyya Jama'at, or the Ahmadiyya religious firm, funded by the Messiah, Ghulam Mirza Ahmad, in 1889 in Punjab. The Deoband firm, as I would call it, the Deoband Madrasa, and its own network of madrasas, founded in 1866. The Barelvi Madrasa Network, religious firm, founded in 1904. The Tablighi Jama'at, founded in 1926. The Jamaat-e-Islami in 1941. And many, many, many others that were effective at more regional or sometimes national levels, accessing then, in the case of the most successful, colonial and ultimately global markets, as I'll talk about. So let's move on then to a case study of some of these transnational religious firms, Indian religious firms from, as it were, that front line of evangelical imperialism, see how they start to move worldwide. So we have here the United States as the first case study. We have here a picture of the Highland Park Ford factory, the first place in the world where there was, of course, the famous assembly line, and it's just next to there where the first mosque, the first purpose-built mosque in America is founded in 1921. And what I want to focus in on is the surrounding organisation that enables that institution to be built. So we'll see now in this section of the paper how an Indian Muslim religious entrepreneur and firm were able to successfully compete in a dynamic and urban religious marketplace in the United States, where of course there were very many effective religious firms and entrepreneurs already established there. We'll see the role then of organisation, propagation, public debate, the use of print media and language skills. And in case it's of interest, there's a very wide set of sources on the building of the first mosque and the organisation around it, whether local newspapers, the newspapers founded by the main entrepreneur I'll talk about, an Urdu autobiography, Latif Sadiq, of the main entrepreneur, and a series of periodicals and magazines in English and in Urdu by the organisation, the religious firm of the Ahmadiyya that support the entrepreneur. So the mosque itself is founded in 1921, and the key investor of the mosque is a Lebanese American, or effectively probably a Lebanese national in that period, called Mohammed Karoub, one of many Lebanese, Eastern Europeans, former Ottoman subjects, who migrated to Detroit to work in the Ford factory and the many other industrial factories around there. The architect, and again this is something we'll see mirrored in this process of exchange, we'll see mirrored in Japan. The architect is not a Muslim at all. He's Theodor Degenhardt, who's previously built houses, a large cinema, and so we're seeing in the style of the mosque itself, this isn't anything like, this isn't traditional Muslim architecture. This is hybrid products of exchange, right down to the stones and the architect. What we're seeing also here in this Detroit context is the competitive terrain that the Muslim entrepreneur, who we'll be talking about, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, was entering a competitive marketplace in which many other religious firms and churches, and again this very liberal and dynamic religious economy of the United States, many other religious firms had moved into Detroit at this period of its massive expansion, its population doubling every 5 to 10 years, as trying to, as it were, capture this, as it were, underserviced marketplace of working class migrants to the city. So along this one avenue, Woodward Avenue, where the mosque itself was built, we have a whole series of these churches, such as the photographs I took there, you'll see here along Woodward Avenue. So we have this figure then, who is the entrepreneur in question? Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, born in Behror in Punjab in India in 1872, studies Urdu and English and some Arabic, so a classic colonial Muslim education. He works in Jammu as a school teacher in one of the schools there operating in the state of Jammu. He then joins the Ahmadiyya Jamaat. He converts to being an Ahmadiyya Muslim. So again, this new religious firm, as I call it. In 1905 to 15, here we have the role of communication technologies is important. He edits the Ahmadiyya's newspaper, Badr, the Crescent Moon. In 1915, according to his autobiography, he goes on Tabligh-i-Qam, so again that new kind of hybrid type of word. He goes on missionary work in India for 2 years. Then in 1917 he goes on Tabligh-i-Qam again, missionary work for 3 years in London and in the UK. In 1920 he sails from London to Philadelphia and starts to expand that mission that he'd been doing in India, then in London, and moving then from beyond colonial into truly global geographies, as it were, working in the United States. The firm, of course, he's with is the Ahmadiyya Jamaat then, as I'm sure many of you know, founded in 1889 by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, one of the greatest Muslim religious entrepreneurs of the 19th century, of any century perhaps, and not least because in that very competitive milieu in the Punjab, where there were so many Christian missionaries active and so many new religious firms, he has the great idea to make himself stand out by saying, I'm not only the Mahdi, the one that all of the Muslims have been expecting for centuries, but I'm also the Masih. So I'm also the Messiah. So he, as it were, combines both, as it were, Muslim and Christian eschatology to increase his status. And he also increases his status by investing very heavily in multilingual printing, whether from English to Urdu to Arabic to Punjabi to any number of languages by the early 1900s. His mission then spreads worldwide. Even in China and Latin America and West Africa, there are Ahmadiyya missionaries by the early 1900s. Not least then working through this massive investment in vernacular print and very, again, in innovative terms. To become an Ahmadiyya Muslim, you would sign on a form in one of their magazines and post it back using the new global postal unions, post back your signed form to the Punjab, and you're a member of the Ahmadiyya, and of course subsequently you'll be investing in it, you'll be paying your tithes as well, like other members. So these are very effective new kinds of transnational, well indeed global religious firms. What are the techniques then that Muhammad Sadiq, as a representative of this religious firm, what are the techniques he's using in the Detroit marketplace? Well, one thing he's doing, and again these are rather typical techniques, again he's a kind of a case study for good reason, he's claiming and founding religious institutions. The Detroit Mosque had been built by Muhammad Karub, but Mufti Muhammad Sadiq hears about it within months of its, just as the time when it opens, he turns up and convinces Karub that he should be the imam. So he effectively, as it were, takes control of a mosque built and paid for by others. He also then later founds a mosque in Chicago. He also uses other pre-existing institutions, town halls, the many workers' halls around Detroit, church halls as well, to preach, as well as in a word he uses a great deal to challenge. He uses then, moving on from claiming and founding institutions, he used the public sphere very widely by preaching, and then again the word he uses in his Urdu autobiography is challenge karna, to make a challenge, to issue challenges for people to show that Islam wasn't, or to disprove that Islam wasn't better than Christianity. So again, he's adopting the techniques of the Christian missionaries, kind of disputing and disproving and refuting Christian claims. Using the public sphere, he travels widely by train across the United States and gets many invitations. He founds his own magazine, there he is in his autobiography. He founds his own magazine, Muslim Sunrise, which actually still continues to the present day, founded in 1921. He writes many newspaper articles, and then of course this is the golden age of American journalism. He publishes many booklets. He uses the effective American postal system to post them to all kinds of people and exchange letters. So he uses the public sphere. He founds his own religious franchise, creates a form of local organisation that again gathers funds not just from the central Ahmadiyya headquarters in the Punjab, but also from more local forms of revenue generation through sales of journals, his journal here, Muslim Sunrise, Isha'at Islam, the Urdu magazine of the Ahmadiyya there as well in the picture. He's selling these journals and booklets, collecting tithes from new members and followers, gathering donations and pledges. So again, using the techniques, of course, well adapted by Indian Muslim religious firms now, but techniques adapted in the 19th century from the Christian missions as voluntary societies. He also uses and starts to gather local cultural and political knowledge as well. He learns a great deal about African American aspirations in this period, of course the period of the Great Migration from the south to these new urban industrial cities. And he makes a big push in the pages of Muslim Sunrise to attract African Americans, say Islam was your true religion, Christianity is the religion of your slavers. Of course, a very key claim among African American Muslims to this day, and we'll see why. He also is very much aware of the popularity of occultism in this period. This, of course, is the period when the Ouija board is actually mass-produced as a popular board game in America. So much of what he's doing is playing upon this kind of popular occultism as well. He actually has a diploma in occult studies that he proudly displays in the magazine. So the results then, he effectively competes in this marketplace, gains many followers. We have the names that have been totted up of between 1,000 and 2,000 converts in this period, and the names are all given in the pages of the many issues of Muslim Sunrise. And these are skills gained then, what I want to emphasize here, these very effective skills taken to the American religious marketplace are skills gained through religious competition in India and then exported overseas through the Anglosphere. So I think there's a very important kind of colonial continuum here. What happens? Well, there are various responses, very competitive responses from Christian newspapers, Christian preachers. There's a great deal of debate generated, as you can see here in the slide, in American newspapers. And very interestingly, perhaps more interestingly, is the way in which African American religious firms and entrepreneurs adapt his techniques as local entrepreneurs, such as the noble Drew Ali, Elijah Muhammad, Wallace Fard Muhammad, the founders of African American Islam, who were exactly in Detroit and later in Chicago, the two places in the very same period where Mufti Muhammad Sadiq is. So the Moorish Temple of Holy Science, founded in Chicago in 1923, the Nation of Islam, founded by Wallace Fard Muhammad in 1930 in Detroit. Elijah Muhammad, the forerunner of the Nation of Islam, is in Detroit in 1923, the very year that the Muslim Sunrise started to outreach to African Americans. And this is well documented, the way in which African Americans had first converted to Ahmadiyya Islam, but then start to follow their own religious organizations, of course by these entrepreneurs who have a better sense of African American aspirations, of demand there in the marketplace. So the story of Sadiq Muhammad is an initial success, but then subsequent failure because he's unable to fully adapt, as it were, as well as local entrepreneurs. So we have then, what I hope I've shown here then, is the way in which a picture of global exchange and dynamic and productive competition in which an Indian Muslim entrepreneur and firm play a key role in exporting Islam worldwide. I'll turn now more briefly to my second case study of Japan, where the first purpose-built mosque was founded in 1935, so 14 years after the mosque in Detroit. And of course, this is a comparative study here. But we'll also see, I think, the same processes at work. That's what I want to show through comparison. Not least through the surrounding organization and the role of an Indian Muslim religious entrepreneur as well. And again, this is a fair question. There were far more Tatar, Central Asian Tatar Muslims in Japan in this period than there were Indian Muslims. So why was it that Indian Muslims were so successful in founding the first mosque, not only founding it, but monopolizing and maintaining control over it? So the sources here are from a range of Arabic, Persian and Urdu travelogues, of which there are many written on Japan and Japanology in the early 1900s, a range of Tatar books and journals published by Tatar Muslims in Japan in the early 20th century, and the mosque records of the Kobe Mosque and the whole trade directories and other records in the Kobe Municipal Archives. So the context here is then the Muslim outreach to Japan after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-5, and also very importantly to mirror what we've seen going on in colonial India and also in the United States, the liberalization of the Japanese religious economy through the 1889 Meiji Constitution, which allows for the first time freedom of conscience and allows non-Japanese religious firms, principally Christians, to operate in Japan. We see then, just as we saw in Detroit, we see in Kobe, the place where the first mosque was founded, a whole range of foreign missionary firms, largely Christians, but also Baha'is and other Muslim entrepreneurs as well, entering that newly liberalizing religious marketplace. So we have a picture then of entrepreneurs and demand. Various Muslim entrepreneurs had turned up before the foundation of the mosque. The great Tatar religious entrepreneur, Abdul Rashid Ibrahim, with his well-known book in Turkish published there in Istanbul, the Alem Islam wa Japaniyada de Intishadiyat Islam, the world of Islam and the world of Islam. So again, a new global terminology. It's not the old Dar al-Islam, it's the Alam Islam, the world of Islam, and the spread of Islam in Japan. Other figures such as the Indian Muhammad Barakatullah in the 1900s and 1910s, who prints his English language magazine in Tokyo, Islamic Fraternity. Another Indian, Azmi Dehlavi, who goes out to try to convert the Japanese. There are rumours that the Japanese emperor is imminently going to convert at this period. Other Tatars as well, Abdul Hayy Qurban Ali, who founds a large Tatar community, and ultimately the later Tokyo Mosque in Japan. But what I'll be looking at then is these Indian religious firm and the key entrepreneur behind it by the name of Muhammad Abdul Karim Bocha, and his firm, in fact his mercantile firm, he works for one of the various silk and textile traders in Kobe, Ahmed Ibrahim Brothers. Through his knowledge then, through working for this textile firm, he draws in VH Turab Ali and Company, another much wealthier firm, which become the initial backer and investor in the mosque project. So we have then, what we effectively see going on then, is on the back of these commercial firms existing in Kobe, run by wealthy Indian Muslims, the foundation of a religious firm. So we have, as it were, one of the managers of these firms is Butcher, becomes a religious entrepreneur, and in 1929 founds what is known in the English documents the Kobe Mosque Committee, in Urdu the Anjumani Masjid Kobe, the same thing, the Kobe Mosque Society, in fact, Anjuman. What that organisation, or rather that religious firm, does is it adapts the techniques of organisational techniques of the voluntary association and the mission to organise its own aims and efforts. It adapts from the landscape of Kobe with many expatriate clubs, including the Indian Club. It adopts the techniques and indeed the membership of the club to create social solidarity and to raise funds from the wealthy Indian merchants there, which are again brought into the committee. It also adopts the methods of a business firm, and of course the methods and the know-how of Butcher and the other members of the committee, because they have many business contacts who they start to tap for funds to build the mosque. So what we can see, this is a very innovative hybrid organisation. It has no precedent in earlier times. The techniques the Anjuman uses then, effectively, we can see it transforming an Indian business network into an Indian religious network. First of all in Kobe itself, through tapping all of the local contacts, and many of these firms there in this period, Indian Muslim textile firms who were tapped for support and pledging donations. And then more broadly, through following the larger business network of those firms through Southeast Asia, to Singapore in particular, to Hong Kong, to Rangoon, and to India, by sending one of the businessmen who has all of these contacts out there around Southeast Asia and India. He goes out, as it were, as a business missionary to tap, as it were, all of the people the Kobe merchants, Indian merchants, do business with. There's a second level of particularly Muslim outreach to other Muslims resident in Japan, to the Tatars who invest in the mosque, to the various diplomats of the newly independent Muslim nations such as Afghanistan and Egypt. They also pledge endowments to the mosque, and also to the smaller number of converts and Japanese imperial Islamophiles who also make some donations as well. I have a full list of how much every particular person and company gave. What's interesting though, there is not here a role of the print media, and I think this is because none of these Indians in Japan, I have no evidence for any of them, let's say, having any Japanese language skills. So they're very effective in the Anglosphere, in America, and using printed output, but not in Japan. So what they do print in Japan is always in English, which we can see now becoming, as it is now today, a global Muslim lingua franca. And again, this kind of use of English more globally is again an outcome of adaptive imperial exchange. What we see here then is although the firm, the Kobe Mosque Committee, the Anjumani Masjid Kobe, that wasn't established for converting Japanese. It was established for the single purpose of building a mosque. But when the mosque is founded and opens as an institution, we know from all the speeches made there that the mosque is intended to start converting Japanese as well. So again, you can see here the production of social power and influence through the creation of institutions. It's notable that one of the most important Japanese converts of the 20th century, Bunpachiro Ahmad Ariga, converts on the site of the Kobe Mosque, and then it's he who translates and publishes in 1938 the first Japanese Quran. We also have the use of using the assistance of their rivals, so adopting then the techniques of the various Christian firms that have been building all of their churches around Kobe and around Yokohama and other port cities. So the Kobe Mosque Committee does exactly that. It employs the expatriate Czech architect Jan Josef Svager, who'd previously built just 2 years earlier the Sacred Heart Catholic Cathedral in Yokohama. They employ him as the architect, and as the contractors they employ the Japanese Takanaka Corporation, which since the Meiji period had been kind of the leading firm in building Western style buildings. So the mosque that's built, again, is very much a kind of a hybrid product of exchange, again using the adaptive logic of the marketplace. What are the outcomes here then? Well, until World War II, when Indians are expelled, as it were, as British imperial citizens, we have the ascendancy of Indian Muslims over the various non-Indian Muslims in Japan, including over the much larger number of Tatar Muslims there. In the archives of the Kobe Mosque, we have the paperwork of various disputes, not least as the Tatars are trying to, as it were, do their own stuff and, as it were, have more influence in the mosque, and they're reminded in no uncertain terms that the very contracts and deeds of endowment of the mosque stipulate that it will be run by an Indian Muslim committee. We ultimately had the expulsion of the Tatars from the mosque at one period as well. After the 1940s, of course, the Indians were expelled. They later come back, and from the 1970s through to the present day, the Imam and the committee that runs the mosque seem to be largely composed of South Asian Muslims as well. But certainly in its initial period, it's, as it were, Indian ascendancy over non-Indian Muslims. It also sets up then, and again in the kind of the competitive and adaptive logic of religious economy, it sets up a model of how to go about institution building. The second and third mosques in Japan then follow very rapidly through the Tatars then, having been, as it were, first absorbed and, as it were, kind of overrun or overruled in the Kobe Mosque. They set up their first mosque in Nagoya, the second mosque in Japan, and the third mosque in Japan established in 1938 in Tokyo. So again, using the same competitive and adaptive logic then, by bringing in outside support. The Tatars couldn't afford to build the mosque themselves, so they get in outside support of rich, wealthy firms. They don't have any of their own wealthy firms, commercial firms, so they bring in the Daibatsu, the great Japanese corporations. But again, emulating, that kind of process of emulative and generative exchange then, copying what the Indian Muslims had done in Kobe. And of course this left ultimately a durable institution and a durable social footprint for Islam in Japan. As you can see from the photograph, the Kobe Mosque was the only significant building in the city to survive the bombing in World War II, and indeed to survive Kobe's other great disaster, the later earthquake. And of course these institutions that survive to the present day in Japan is the oldest and the first mosque in Japan. So to move to my conclusions then, question one that I'd asked, how did Islam become a truly global religion in the early 20th century, as it were, moving beyond its early modern periods of global expansion, those geographies across Eurasia and Africa, and moving beyond colonial geographies to become a truly global religion, exemplified here by the United States and Japan in the early 20th century. And I've argued that that comes about through an adaptive and competitive response to 19th century evangelical imperialism, as Muslims adapted the organizational techniques of Christian firms, the organizational mode of the mission and the voluntary association, its forms of revenue generation, the communicational techniques of those missionary firms through translation, vernacularization, printing, propagation through printing, through the adaptation of transportational techniques, the use of train, steamship, rail travel, and the use of, as it were, the focus on transportational hubs that become new Muslim spaces. Bombay is one I've written about a great deal. Of course, London is another of, another of those in the later 20th century. What we have created then as an outcome is a new geography of Islam based around business hubs and transport hubs. So a new, distinctly modern, globalized geography of Islam. And of course, also, we even see that in much of the architecture of these new mosques founded worldwide. These are mosques, not shrines, as it were. They're distinct, separate, as it were, separate institutions from the early modern institutions of Muslim globalization, which would typically be shrines or shrines plus mosques. And they're also very often designed and built by Western architects. They're often Orientalized mosques, but not through some process of Orientalism, I would say, but through this dynamic of exchange that we've seen going on, not least with the American and the Czech designers of the Kobe and Detroit mosques. So, that's for how Islam became truly global. It's a competitive response, an adaptive and competitive response to 19th century Muslim evangelical imperialism. But why were Indian Muslims disproportionately influential? And I think this is the case certainly when we look from West Africa to Southeast Asia to South and East Africa to the United States, Japan, Germany. It's not to say there were, as it were, the not pre-existing Muslim institutions there, but when we look at, as it were, the new religious firms, the transnational religious firms, Indian Muslims are, kind of conspicuously present in so many of these different markets, not least in founding mosques in these regions. And they do so, I think, through access and their use of imperial travel and business networks that ultimately become global business travel networks, their advanced ability of their skills in English, which is very useful in the expanding British to American Anglosphere of the 20th century. And they also have the relative advantage compared to other religious entrepreneurs and firms, the relative advantages of being early adapters. That, as I say, Indian Muslims are really at the cliff face, bore the brunt, as it were, of this evangelical imperialism, of course, compared to other Muslim regions which were colonized for much shorter regions. They effectively then adapt print and organization in a much more effective way than religious entrepreneurs did from other regions. Overall, then, what I think we've seen is a larger process then of dynamic and generative exchange, which is the subject of my new book, Terrains of Exchange. And we can see here again in the photograph here of the Woking Mosque and the Berlin Mosques, again in these different places. It's again Indian Muslim entrepreneurs, particularly the religious firm of the Ahmadiyya, who are again disproportionately present in so many of these new terrains or new marketplaces of Islam. And this process then of dynamic and generative exchange shows to me that interaction isn't merely, as it were, something that's passive, it's something that is productive and indeed religiously generative. And I think that explains why globalization, in fact, has led to not only more, but more varied religion in the world. And of course, here I'm kind of responding to that older pattern of, as it were, of sociology and indeed of kind of globalization theory, which would see either less religion or more standardized, more homogenized, more uniform religiosity in the world. What I see going on is, in fact, quite the opposite, a process in which globalization leads to more and more varied religion in the world through the dynamic and generative process of exchange. Thank you for bearing with me.
Okay, wow, thank you for that very lucid and quite persuasive, at least in my, for me, paper. So it's for me to try to formulate a question while everybody gets theirs in better order. I wanted to ask you, first of all, I think you've made a convincing case for the novel features of what's happening here, right? So I obviously print is novel, all the networks are novel, but I wanted to ask you about maybe some of the continuities, especially when it comes to architecture, because the mosques that are built in Central Asia and in South Asia from the very beginning used local materials, adopted local motifs, architectural motifs. So I wonder if you're not overstating the novelty of the mosque, of at least the architectural forms that the mosques take in Japan and Detroit. So that's my first question. And my second question is to push you a little bit on the social power that is created through this, especially when it comes to the Ahmadiyya. Because obviously this is a really marginal group of Muslims who are attacked and disavowed as apostates. So how does that work? Are they not? And it seems to me like sorry, not that coherent question. But are they really successfully achieving power in these places? It sounded to me from the story in Detroit that they had a brief glimpse of it and then were eclipsed. So
yeah, good. Yeah, they're two nice questions. Yeah. So with the first one, I think you're absolutely right that whenever we look at the kind of the history of mosque architecture over kind of the longue durée, we see that forms of adaptation to different regional styles and different regional materials whether the kind of the early kind of Byzantine type styles in kind of, let's say, in Umayyad Syria, or to kind of when we get to Southeast Asia, these kind of wooden style buildings, or the very kind of Sinai-sized kind of mosques in China. And of course that seems to be art historians will explain why this is kind of local architects doing this who aren't necessarily Muslim. So I think you're absolutely right that there is perhaps kind of a longer term pattern going on there. But what I'd still say that is somewhat different in this way is that we don't actually have any more by this period. This is actually kind of a somewhat distinct process really of not actually kind of the localization of mosque architecture style-wise, but actually the globalization of mosque architecture, because we're actually getting much more standardized mosque-looking buildings around the world that, as I said, they're orientalized. They're often a bit of this and a bit of that, but they're in no way local. I mean, the Woking Mosque in itself is a great example because it's an amalgam of some bits of kind of Egyptian architecture, some bits of Indian, some bits of, you know, what the British architect, you know, kind of conceived of a mosque should look like. So, as I said, that, you know, on the one level, there's a larger picture of, you know, the variegation of mosque architecture in different, you know, kind of regions around the world through history. But I think here this is something different going on. It's not so much the localization as, for want of a better word, you know, the globalization of something more of a hybridization, which is very much, you know, kind of seen by global theorists as being the, you know, kind of the symptomatic cultural product of globalization, these kind of hybrid products. And I think the mosques are that architecturally. The second question about the Ahmadiyya, I mean, certainly, we can kind of question the success and how we might measure that of the Ahmadiyya, or I'd rather talk in terms of maybe the impact of the Ahmadiyya. And of course, they're only one of the groups I look at. They just happen to be the ones that, you know, kind of were there behind the mosque in Detroit, as they were, you know, kind of, they didn't found the Woking Mosque, but they took over it and ran it for a long time. We have there, the image is actually, the Urdu image there is actually the Woking, the first sermon at the Woking Mosque printed in Urdu for distribution in India. So, you know, kind of so the Ahmadiyya are there too. So Ahmadiyya are certainly very influential in this period, I think the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, really influential worldwide in terms of mosque founding in so many new regions and spreading Islam worldwide. Then I think they become less successful for a number of regions, partly because, of course, in the post-colonial period, we have in Pakistan what isn't anymore a liberal religious economy. The state, unlike the colonial state, is clearly that the Pakistani state does become a player in the religious economy of Pakistan. And one of the things that, of course, it does, and you're referring to, is apostates, the Ahmadiyya. But they're still, I think, even to this day, despite, I think, that their great period of impact is circa 1900 or 1890 through, let's say, 1930s, 1940s. But even today, I mean, they're incredibly influential. They actually produced recently a book of the mosques founded by the Ahmadiyya worldwide in the last 20 years. It's an extraordinary number of mosques that have been founded. And again, I think they might not necessarily have, you know, kind of millions, what they claim to, but, you know, whether there are millions of people converting worldwide to Ahmadiyya Islam. But I think by virtue of the fact that they control these religious institutions, that itself is social power and indeed political power as well. I mean, after all, many states around the world now are trying to, as it were, influence, as it were, and control through their own state-sponsored imams, that figures in the mosques. And I was reminded of Ahmadiyya power even to this day very recently in Los Angeles, about 3 months ago, that the new Khalifa, the head of the Ahmadiyya, the successor of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the fourth Khalifa, the fourth Caliph, if I recall correctly, he did an official visit to Los Angeles, and he met with the mayor of Los Angeles, the deputy governor of California, you know, obviously America's biggest and wealthiest state, in this kind of incredibly grand event at the big Beverly Hills Hotel, in which there were, you know, 1,000 people present. I mean, this was like, you know, an extraordinary, you know, kind of level of kind of, you know, kind of head of state kind of level of visiting. So still they have, you know, kind of a great deal of connections and wealth that I think enables them still, as it were, to, if not fight above their weight, because I'm not talking about conflict, but certainly to compete above their weight.
Sure, thank you.
Well, thank you, that's great. As always, so many questions that I will ask you. One actually is a follow-up question on the Ahmadiyya. I think this seems to be, I mean, there's no way to avoid the group when writing history of Islam in the Muslim minority world in the 20th century. And, I think there's one more mosque actually I haven't mentioned, it's the Fazl Mosque in London, which was also founded, I think, by the Ahmadiyya, I think in 28. And then, of course, they took over the Woking Mosque and the Wilmersdorf Mosque in Berlin and so on. And I think in all these cases, I mean, especially in the Wilmersdorf case, I'm wondering I'm also wondering about conflicts. I mean, I just know the Wilmersdorf case, and I know that they tried to negotiate with different other groups, and in the end they found various compromises. For example, having a Muslim of different groups leading the Friday prayers. So, for example, one week it was the Imam of the Iranian embassy. Then another week it was Sunni, and so on. And so basically they tried to found this kind of ecumenical community, that way, and to avoid conflicts. And I'm not sure if they really, I mean, in the Berlin case, I think they didn't really manage. And I'm wondering how it was in Detroit. And I think the only exception is perhaps Paris, because the Grand Mosque de Paris was basically really in the hand of North African colonial subjects at the time. So they hadn't really, they weren't able to come in there. I think there wasn't, a French Ahmadiyya mosque, so that might be an interesting case to look at.
Yeah.
So this was the first. Second question is very brief. It's about the state, basically. What role does the state play in the American and in the Japanese case? I mean, I know that Rashid Ibrahim was very active in the Second World War, promoting Japan as the global patron of Islam and so on. I know in the German case that most of the dealings, most of the issues about the Muslim community in Berlin was dealt with by the Foreign Office, not the Office of Interior or so on, because it was considered, Islam in Germany was considered a foreign policy issue. And there was the idea that the way how we treat Muslims, tiny Muslim community in Germany, would have an effect on our relations to the wider to states and countries in the wider Muslim world. So I wonder, in your narrative, the state doesn't play a central role. I wonder if it should perhaps be played any more.
Yeah, I think it depends. I'll try to answer, if I can, put the two questions together by at least starting off here with the question about the state. I think certainly the two case studies I've looked at today are case studies, including, I suppose, colonial India as the background there, are case studies where the state plays a much lesser role, because that's what I'm more interested in. Because my bigger story here is one of the process of generative exchange, where new things come about through exchange. And that process, of course, comes about much more in as it were, liberal religious economies, that's to say, where the state has a much lesser level of or at least a commitment to non-interference within religious exchange within a particular domain. So Japan after the Meiji Constitution, the United States, of course, after its own early constitution, and in India as part of the whole formal setup of the of the East India Company, and indeed of the colonial state thereafter. But of course there are certainly limitations there when one looks at it more closely. I mean, of course, the classic case in the US, of course, is the changing of immigration law, which, whether one's looking at the bringing of Islam to Japan or the bringing of other kind of Asian religions, it's the changes of immigration law in the 1920s, of course, which aren't kind of repealed until 1965. That makes, in many ways, the big change. So the state isn't, as it were, isn't acting on, as it were, against religious figures, but it does have, as it were, collateral damage, as it were, as religious entrepreneurs from Asia aren't allowed to come in, at least much more easily, from the changes of immigration laws in the 1920s. Then, in the case of Japan, again, Japan has its commitment to the Meiji Constitution of 1889 to freedom of religion, but it also actually recognizes some religions more than others. So Christianity, Shinto, Buddhism are recognized as religions, but Islam isn't. It doesn't mean that Islam can't operate, but it does mean there are certain kind of state advantages and state investments and so on that it's not able to get. So again, there is a role for the state. But I think nonetheless these regions do function as liberal, if not perfectly liberal. There is no such thing of any perfectly liberal religious or commercial economy anywhere in the world. But these are relatively liberal economies. If I were to look at other regions that were, as it were, non-liberal religious economies, then of course they'd be much less dynamic and productive. So they wouldn't be telling the kind of story that I want to talk about the spread of the global productivity of religious movements. It's interesting that to move on to your first question then, that Paris is an interesting case there, because of course the states, kind of the classic French model of the state has always been much more of a kind of an interfering interfering in the religious life as well as kind of the other life of its citizens. And of course the Paris Mosque, as you know better than I do, of course was effectively founded as a gift to the soldiers of North African origin after the First World War. So that was, as it were, a classic kind of outcome of the French religious economy in which the state plays a very central role. It's a state-funded mosque. So that kind of fits, as it were, that mosque actually is very much the outcome of that type of religious economy in which the state plays a central role. When we compare, as I say, to the Woking Mosque or others, then it's actually, as it were, kind of the free religious exchange, and an entrepreneur who happened to be Ahmadiyya, they might have happened to be something else, actually. Of course, when we look at other regions of the world, I mean, in the Indian Ocean world, we have, through into the 20th century, we have a much larger role of, as it were, of Sufi religious organizations there, founding institutions in South Africa and in Southeast Asia. Again, it's a different religious marketplace there, with the demand there, the religious demand is of largely indentured and lower class labourers, and the Islam they want, the religiosity they want is a shrine-based religiosity of the Nagor Dargah that you have in Singapore and in Malaysia as well, and of course the shrine of Sufi Sahib and others in Durban. So again, there are these, certainly one of the things I'm interested in is saying, look, what I want to focus on is the process, the dynamics of religious exchange and that model. But when we apply them to different types of terrain, different religious markets, different areas of interaction, the outcomes will be different. In the same period, 1911, you have, the founding of these Sufi shrines in Durban, another very modern port city. But yet in other places, kind of in London, we've got these mosques that have got no place of a shrine whatsoever, often by impresarios of Islam that are saying that there is no room for shrines and tombs and bodies. But it's the interplay of supply and demand, who the entrepreneurs are, who they're supplying their religiosity to from the demand side, that determines the outcomes in a given terrain, whether there is a state player in Paris or not. So I hope that gets around to answering questions.
Yeah, can I just add to what you said in response to David Mortadale's question? Because I think with Japan, for example, there is this aspect of Pan-Asianists, who have been around basically from the late 19th century, becoming increasingly interested in sort of co-opting or taking under its wings various religious groups in Asia. So that Japan, this is part of Japan's claim to be the leader of Asia. And we once had a very interesting paper in this seminar given by Selçuk Esenberg, who talked about Japanese Muslims who went to Mecca for Hajj, and they were expressly told to pitch their tent next to the pilgrims from Central Asia for political reasons of basically trying to get them to see that Japan was the country that they should sort of follow. So there is this very interesting kind of it's sort of like semi-official aspect of Japanese Pan-Asian thinkers really sort of funding quite a lot of these activities, as well as being sort of propagators of sort of Asian interests in a very wide sense, including religion, with the government and with the army and also just society generally. And then this actually sort of, in some sense, leads to my second question, which is that I found your argument incredibly persuasive, this kind of whole notion of religious firms and how firms actually circulate in this kind of vast ocean in the world. And I thought, particularly with the South Asian network, I could just see similar things in Singapore, in Straits settlements. It's sort of all over Asia and I'm sure in Africa as well. But this sort of your explanation that these derived from commercial networks and funding and the people necessary to set up this network was based on commercial network, I think really works for this particular kind of network. But I just wondered what you think about this sort of competition. You talk about competition with sort of Christian missionary groups, that's their networks. But what about competition within Muslim groups? Because you went on to say that there are Tatar Muslims in Japan, and they got kicked out of this mosque at one point. And of course, Abdul Rashid Ibrahim he went to Japan to set up the first mosque, but obviously this happened in Kobe and not where he wanted it to happen. And and then he said subsequently they established mosque in Nagoya and Tokyo. Nagoya is a much less obvious place for me. Tokyo I can see why he might have gone up there. But what about the Muslims who do not belong to this fantastic trade network that we see in Asia and Africa? I mean, how do they kind of go around doing this? Are they a part of a different narrative altogether? Do they not have these kind of religious firms model that you've just explained?
Right, okay, so I'll start off with the first question. I mean, certainly you're right that whether with Pan-Asianists or through the Japanese expansion into Manchuria actually had a considerable interest with Islam as well, because there's a large number of Hui Muslims who were there in Manchuria. And indeed, one of the key Tatar religious entrepreneurs within Japan, Abdullah Qurban Ali, actually kind of worked as a spy, a sort of multilingual spy, being a Tatar Russian. He knew Russian, so he was very effective in kind of the building. He actually worked with, there was a separate intelligence service for the Manchurian Railway. And he actually died ultimately. He died in a Siberian prison camp when he was having been captured. So certainly with regard to the Tatars, there was a much closer link to the state and with various levels of secret service of the Black Dragon Society, various Pan-Asian organizations, etc. But for me, what's all the more interesting then is not having had time to talk about that, but in the background to the presentation I've given about the Kobe Mosque is how, in spite of that role of the kind of the Japanese state and imperial state having its own interests in Islam and in kind of creating and controlling a Muslim community or giving the sense of Japan as a supporter of Islam, in spite of all that, it's actually the Indians who found the first mosque. Even on Japanese soil, so to me that's very interesting. And indeed I think, the Tatars actually do then, when we have the foundation of the Tatar mosque, then the Tatar mosque in Nagoya, then the Tatar mosque in Tokyo, there's almost kind of a transition there. What's interesting about the Nagoya mosque is that we have, even though it's a Tatar founded mosque, and the imams are Tatar, the community is Tatar, there's no Indians in Nagoya, the person who lays the foundation stone is another Indian Muslim entrepreneur, this fascinating figure who founds the All-Malaya Muslim Missionary Society. So they're coming out of Singapore. So they're this Indian, he's actually born and bred in India, he's from India, he lives a lot of his life in North India, near Lucknow. He's sets up this Malaya organization, and Malays are already Muslim, but now they've got this very effective Indian Muslim kind of running them and setting up mosques for them. He also starts this kind of bigger worldwide thing. He starts to found mosques for indentured laborers and former indentured laborers in the Caribbean. So, it's this extraordinary figure. But he also lays the first stone of the Nagoya Mosque as well. So, the Indians are kind of, very effectively being brought in, and I think even seen as these kind of leading figures who are, kind of doing stuff by the Tatars as well. But by the time, just a few years later, with the foundation of the Tokyo Mosque, that's when we do have, if not directly the Japanese state, but certainly, as I say, the Daibutsu, the big corporations, they're investing money in there as well. So, so it could be that that's somewhere between, following what the
corporations or real corporations.
Real corporations, yeah, absolutely. The kind of the big firms like, whatever they would be. Yeah. So that's in a sense. It looks to me like they're trying to follow the Indian Muslim model of firms investing, but they haven't got their own Tatar commercial firms, so they bring the Japanese ones. But it might be that there's a political role between, obviously, these great big corporations were, building steamships and gunboats and whatever else as well. For the second question, what happens for organisations, let's say religious entrepreneurs who don't have all these commercial firms behind them, they don't have the wealth of all of these types of commercial supporters, they create different types of religious firm. So what I'm interested in is saying how, well, we can use the same analytical language of talking about a firm, but still say, well, there are different types of organisation of a firm, different forms of investment and investors in a firm, and that will have their different outputs, rather than just talk about, the religious groups and communities and leaders and sects. So some types of firm, such as the Kobe Muslim Mosque Committee, they do indeed have, kind of these commercial backers, but various other kinds of firms don't. So, for example, the Ahmadiyya don't have that, but they raise their funds through the voluntary subscription of large numbers of donors who might give a rupee here, or $10 there, or £10 sterling there. So it's a very different business model, if you like, for founding the firm. But so, I mean, it might well be that, I mean, evidently, you know, kind of religious impresarios that have the backing of corporations or whatever else can, you know, maybe actually do have a comparative advantage. That may well be the case. But nonetheless, there are various forms of firm that can operate, as I say, you know, kind of with whether subscription or indeed the kinds of entrepreneurs that I've talked about in other chapters of the book that are working in rural areas with actually kind of with much lower forms of investment from perhaps kind of day labourers or whatever else, that don't become transnational firms but do become quite effective in their local regions, you know, not least through their you know, adaptation to local cultural demands and tastes. So there are many different types of religious firm, but the analytical language is the same, but the different, as it were, business models, you know, to continue the language, you know, can vary tremendously.
Yeah, I'm just like a little comment first. I think you should relativise your sense of how the breach between the early modern and modern, because I mean, printing does start in Istanbul in 1720 something or other, even though on non-religious texts. And there is a Muslim community in the West made up of slaves, which has something of a religious life, despite the harshness of early modern slavery. But my question really is whether you're not exaggerating the South Asian at the expense of the Arabs. It's an old quarrel within Islam. And it's really interesting that the mosque in Detroit was actually founded by a Syrian, or a Lebanese, but I mean the usual terms was Syrian. As I think I'm right in saying the first mosque ever was the one in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1873. Why Cedar Rapids, Iowa? Who knows, but this was a Syrian mosque. And it would be, I think, really interesting to try and see, you know, why one gets a certain division of labour and where the Syrians are in fact at the forefront. And the other thing about that is that they are, on the whole, much more anti-Ahmadi than the South Asians. I mean, the Ahmadiyya is a South Asian organisation. It has all sorts of, you know, it can pull all sorts of strings in South Asia which just don't work in Syria. So why on earth would Karoum, you know, back an Ahmadi? I mean, there's something really strange about this.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, the first part of your question, I mean, certainly Ibrahim Mutafarrika and then his son for a shorter period of printing in Istanbul in the mid-18th century, but they don't print for very long, and they print a relatively short number of titles. So as in kind of many forms of technological innovation, you know, kind of the history of technology, there are kind of these kind of early figures who kind of start something up, but it doesn't continuously spread. So that's why I did, you know, the beginnings of Muslim printing through this kind of later period, because Mutafarrika doesn't continue with his work. But even so, I mean, even with Mutafarrika, it's an interesting example of showing the same process, of demonstrating the same process of exchange. Mutafarrika was, as you probably know well, but for the rest of the audience, was actually, seems to have been a Hungarian convert from Christianity who brought the skills that he learned in, as it were, kind of southeastern Europe from those Christian contexts, then to Istanbul with him. In terms of the earlier mosques and so on, I believe that the Detroit mosque was the first purpose-built mosque, so something built as a building. But I think, you know, it's certainly the case that, you know, the emerging history of Islam in America has had various claimants, obviously, to what is, you know, an important first. As regards the why would a Syro-Lebanese founder or investor in the mosque and employ an Ahmadiyya, I think that's the case with the Ahmadiyya in many other cases. They present themselves as being Muslim. They don't present themselves as normatively Muslim. They don't necessarily present themselves as being Ahmadiyya and being a sect. So that sometimes comes later.
Was he a Lahorian? Was Lahorian much closer to Orthodox?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you know, I'm not entirely sure about that, and I should probably check on that. But certainly, you know, kind of in the literature of Muslim sunrise that he produces, there's occasionally mention of the Messiah and Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, but there is occasion that. But by and large, it's really that this is Islam. So, and I think that's very much what happened in Woking as well. That, you know, kind of much of the activity coming out of there was in that way. But I think again, again, it's a period of relative success for a certain period. I'm not saying the Ahmadiyya. I mean, the Ahmadiyya are one example of the more successful Indian religious firms, of course, are the Tablighi Jamaat and the Jamaat-e-Islami, which has its branches, you know, throughout its national branches in many parts of the world outside of South Asia, whether in the West or whether in Southeast Asia and other regions as well. So it's these other South Asian organisations that I think are are the more of the success stories in the longer term. But of course, in this period I'm dealing with in particular, the Ahmadiyya, I think, where we have the larger outreach. And then to return to the US context, why do I think that was the case? Well, again, it's kind of looking at, when we look at the various, certainly we have kind of quite a large pattern of immigration of even Albanian Muslims, Syro-Lebanese, the occasional Egyptians. We have Muslims coming from all kinds of regions, and some Africans as well. Obviously, there's an earlier history of kind of slave Muslims as well. But none of these figures, of course, that we know of, were religious entrepreneurs. They were very lower class. They either came as slaves in the kind of antebellum period, or they came as, and then fortunately converted in a sense there. So there was a kind of the role of the state in that period. But again, it's a different period I'm interested in. But these the migrants that come are kind of really lower class rural labourers. They're not educated. They don't have the skill set that these Indian Muslims do. And that's what I think. That's what I'm pointing to. Is that the role of the Indian Muslims is they have these kind of extraordinary skill set. They have fluency in English, literacy, perfect literacy in English. They can make public debates. They know how to edit and publish newspapers. They have funding behind them. So they have all of these attributes and abilities and skills as well, which set them off as religious entrepreneurs in a way that, despite the much larger number of the thousands and tens of thousands of, let's say, former Ottoman subjects and Muslims within the United States by this period, that's what explains, I think, why that one Indian Muslim can do so much. So, again, that's a story of this kind of exchange process that had happened that hadn't happened in the Ottoman Empire. One simply doesn't have Ottoman subjects, at least particularly that class, and that many of them, who are fluent in English, etc., etc. So this is the kind of the story I'm explaining that explains that, because it is extraordinary that there should be this one Indian Muslim who did so much when there's all these, kind of tens of thousands of former Ottoman Muslims, in New York and Detroit and other places too.
Well, that has been speaking for a full 90 minutes, so I'm going to give you a chance to ask one last question if you want to, but otherwise we will let him be and thank him in the normal way for a great.
Well, thank you.